welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Turn the Page podcast, Syosset Public Library, and my guest today is...
I am Fenderson Djeli Clark, author of this thing called Ring Shout.
Which is a fantastic book. It was one of those books that as soon as I saw it on NetGalley, I was like, must have this one. I'm going to let you talk a bit about it a little bit, but I'm going to say from my perspective, you know, there's a lot of talk lately, or the last few years, about there being a Buffy reboot, but I would say if there was a television version of this book, I would be totally good because it was so good.
Well, the book itself is set in 1920s Georgia, and it's basically set around, in some ways, the backdrop of the film The Birth of a Nation. And in this story, the main protagonist and two of her friends are basically bootleggers by day, and by night they are fighting monsters, Buffy style, that have been basically unleashed by the film The Birth of a Nation, right? So that's the general premise, and there's magic, there's swords, there's monsters. It's like a fantasy, but set in 1920s Georgia.
So it was great, and I think when I was reading the description of it, when I was scrolling through NetGalley to see what was coming up, so it did mention that Birth of a Nation, the film, was a bit like, it was like an incantation, and D.W. Griffith was a sorcerer
right.
who brought this film, and as a former film theory major, I was like, okay, I definitely have to read this one. I was lucky enough to have a film theory professor who has unfortunately passed away, but who did not show us the entirety of Birth of a Nation.
It's very long.
Oh my God. He told us, he's like, yeah, well, first of all, it's really, really long. Like, second of all, I'm going to show you clips and you'll get it. And he showed us clips and we were like,
yeah, that
is pretty messed up. There is, it comes from a book called The Klansman, and it is very pro-Klan. Extremely pro-Klan. I remember one of the scenes that he showed us was the heroine she was in trouble, and the Klansman was saving her from all of, the characters who were Black, who were, I guess, menacing her, and she looks under his hood and sees that it's her sweetheart, and she's like, oh, thank goodness it's you, swoon. And I mean, all of us, this was back in the late 90s, and all of us in the class who were like, I guess the ones who weren't like, what the F, they kind of were like, what the F, loudly in the classroom, and the others knew well enough to keep their mouths shut if they were in there. But it was pretty jarring. And just within the background of everything that's happening now, it's so timely because we think very much of the Ku Klux Klan as something of the past, but it's really not. And the mentality is not gone. Unfortunately, in the area that I live, there are towns where they still distribute flyers or put them under people's, windshields. So they might not be as open in the way that they were in the time of the book, but they're there. So the main character, she is a bit of a chosen one.
And in a way, somewhat, right? Like, so, nobody likes the chosen one things anymore. So she, in a sense, is, but there's a twist to it, right?
There is, and I don't want to
give it away,
what it is.
Yeah, so I don't think I set out to subvert the chosen one trope, but I guess I kind of ended up doing so. Though I've loved books. I grew up reading a ton of books, but great chosen ones. Often the best ones are the reluctant ones. She's a bit more eager.
She really is. So is it Maurice?
Maurice, yes.
Maurice. And she fights with her comrades are Sadie and Chef, aka Cordelia, who I have to ask, was that a Buffy reference or was that just me?
It wasn't, but I can see how you would think that, right? Cordelia Chase. No, it wasn't, but that's a good one, yeah.
It was like a few weeks ago, just when I was writing down notes, getting ready for this interview, I was thinking to myself, just the whole thing that I said in the beginning, how I would be totally happy if Ring Shout was a TV series and we just didn't need a Buffy reboot. And then I was like, I wonder if Cordelia was actually...
Who knows? Maybe it was a subconscious reference. Who knows? I do also call her Cordy at times, right? It just seemed to fit.
But Chef she's a bit of a gender nonconformist.
Mm-hmm.
She's gay.
Yeah.
And Sadie is she's kind of
the wild card.
Yes, exactly. And then there's Maurice, who is not the reluctant chosen one. She's got her sword. She's ready to go in.
Yeah.
And the demons, and we have not mentioned this, the demons that they're fighting are Ku Kluxes, who take over the bodies of white people who are driven by hate. And, they see... they watch Birth of a Nation, and it's like we had mentioned, an incantation which invites in these demons. Mm-hmm. How did you come up with that idea?
So I have to admit that part of it was in some ways history. So the idea, for instance, of the Klan being monsters in some ways. Well, there's the old idea, of course, that within the first Klan that comes about after the Civil War, there was always this notion of them supposedly being ghosts, right? And so they would pretend at times they were ghosts at night. But if you go back and read the ex-slave narratives, right? The narratives of ex-slaves taken in the 1920s and the 30s, and they're talking about that first Klan, they point out that many of them would wear various things. Some of them would wear horns. Some of them would wear various things to look more monstrous, right? And so basically, it was reading those ex-narratives that first gave me this idea. I read those years ago, but I just jotted down the notes that this notion of the Klan is monstrous, right? And these former slaves experiencing the first Klan, calling them haints and ghosts. And so it kind of flowed from there. And then fast forward to the time of the book and Birth of a Nation, we're talking about the rise of the second Klan, right? The first Klan is pretty much defunct for several reasons. It's pretty much hunted down by Ulysses S. Grant, President Grant, and also its job is achieved, right? Segregation and Jim Crow have become the law of the land. It was in many ways an insurgency terrorist organization attempting to curtail Reconstruction, and it won in some ways. It got what it wanted. And so for the most part, it pretty much was non-existent until the Birth of a Nation, right? Until D.W. Griffith is inspired by by Dixon's work, The Klansman and The Leopard Spot, which had been books, which had been play, and they decide we're going to adapt it this time into a film. And in this film, they basically, as you talked about and seeing it, how you're like, what's going on? They basically put the lost cause on steroids. They rewrote history through the film, right? Told their own version of the Civil War, of Reconstruction, in which the Klan aren't terrorists, but actually a noble, valiant, protective organization. And it turns out it's the former slaves who are the real terror, who they have to protect against, right? And this comes out in 1915, and one of the reasons you likely saw it in film school was because it is pivotal as a film, as one of these first cinematic endeavors that uses certain lighting and camera angles, the music, the score. It is, it's the first of these. In some ways, it's the grandfather of our modern cinema, right? It's the problematic grandfather of how we think of modern cinema. And so you can imagine white audiences went in and watched this film. And this is the early 1900s. People are already primed to believe terrible things about African Americans. and then they see this vivid thing on screen that is almost lifelike, right? And so part of what I was trying to get at in the story, this notion of, I mean, yeah, especially if you're taking film theory, you get it, this notion of films kind of hypnotizing, right? This notion of how does the communicator and the receiver, right? And watching these films. And I got it from stories. Like there was a story of a guy watching The Birth of a Nation in 1915, sometime around there, Florida. And he sees one of these scenes of a white man in blackface chasing a young white woman, and he pulls out a gun and starts shooting at the screen. Right? I don't know if he was just drunk or what have you, but then I asked people to think. I said, think about it in a sense, right? You're talking about people who had never seen this type of media. Imagine if we were thrown like in Star Trek on the holodeck, right? Yeah. And we see these things and how real and vivid it was to people, right? And in a sense, I don't want to say it hypnotized them, but there's a word like that for it, right? In the way that it drew on their already worst ideas and it magnified them. And the reason it's so important is that The Birth of a Nation, as we know, is instrumental in creating the Second Klan. It is Albert Simmons in Georgia who sees the film, becomes so enamored by it that he decides to set out to create the Klan again. And this second Klan is much bigger than the first. It's not just in some southern states. It is all over the U.S. It can claim millions of members. Up here in New England, it is in New York, it is in Seattle, it's everywhere. And so that is the era in which this story is taking place, right? But the second Klan has come about and it's transcendent. And I just decided to add some magic and monsters into the mix because why not?
Yeah, it was all of those things. It was very, and you bring up a lot of points that I think, we don't see them in that, maybe they are, in that sense. But I mean, in general, not as toxic or not toxic, but like people go to see a Marvel movie. Yeah. And they're buying all sorts of paraphernalia with their favorite Marvel character on it. Somebody I was recently talking to a few weeks ago was talking about how archery became huge for girls after the rise of the Hunger Games. Yeah. So it's not far-fetched at all. And it's very easy when you draw the conclusion of what, how these blockbusters affect people's mindset, even now.
So you can imagine in 1915 how people would show up and you could buy a Klan outfit and have like a pennant and
you were
root for the Klan while you were watching it. And
I did not know
faint.
That.
Like people would see certain scenes and literally faint watching it, right? And part of it is, against media theory, it's the medium, right? It's this new medium that people are unused to. Things today that we're like, well, how could people take that as real? For people in 1915, very much so, yeah.
So some of the things, so the title of the book, would you like to just describe where that came from? I know I did a little research about Ring Shout, but for our listeners.
Right, Ring Shouts were in many ways these traditions from the African American South, dating back to the age of slavery, that a form of, mostly it's forms of religious worship, but there are also different ways of expression in music. And the shout itself is actually the movement of people within a ring in a certain manner, but it also comes along with these songs that are often very syncopated and very rhythmic. And I think I'd first seen some ring shouts performed by some performers. I can't remember when, but I was amazed by them. And so when it came time to write the story, I think I must have tried to find as many of these as I could, from modern performances to the ones they have at the Library of Congress that they collected from some of those former slaves in the 1920s and 30s, right? Tried to imbue this tradition.
So other things that you mentioned, you give these demonic powers to the night doctors. Were a big character, and that was something I had to look up because with everything else I was reading, I'm like, okay, this comes from something. And the night doctors were Klan members. Well, why don't you tell us about
Yeah,
it?
it's interesting. So again, going back to those ex-slave narratives, I first came across the idea of night doctors in those slave narratives where they were supposed to be these shadowy figures that former slaves said stole away Black people and experimented on them. Right? And I said, well, this is bizarre. I remember jotting down the notes and coming across it 3 or 4 times. So this is different people who were formerly enslaved being interviewed in North Carolina or in Alabama and Virginia. And they're all telling versions of this same story, right? And so it was much later on, I was reading works on racism in medicine in the United States and come to find out that night doctors are part of this folklore. And it was based at times on actual experimentations done on the bodies of enslaved men, women, and children. There are many stories and documented things on this, whether it was forms of gynecology or smallpox or what have you. Enslaved people were sometimes used in for those medical experiments. And also the selling of deceased slaves' bodies to medical schools, which was common, right? That the bodies would be disappeared to these medical schools to be used as cadavers with, of course, the enslaved people. Their families had no say in this, right? They were literally donating or at times selling these bodies. And so in a way, some say the night doctors came about, some attribute it to African Americans as this symbolic way to talk about what had happened, imbuing it with folklore. Others say it may have come from slave owners themselves who were trying to find ways to scare African Americans, and no one's really certain. It's just one of those shadowy folklore. But I was really drawn to it. It's interesting that you point out that some think they're clans, because what happens is after slavery, people start conflating them. And so sometimes the night doctors are supposed to be during slavery, but they're Klan members. You can tell what's happening is what happens with folklore. Stories are getting mixed up back and forth, and it's hard to tell what is what. And some of these ideas end up flowing up north, so that people in Washington, D.C. talk about running into doctors and bottle men who might stick you with a prick, and and then you end up somewhere and you're experimented on. And so I remember if people have seen the movie Get Out, there's the scene where I forget the actor, Stanfield, he's about to be kidnapped. And the first thing I thought of, I was like, oh, this is Night Doctor, somebody kidnapping someone to experiment on, and how that has to do a lot with the very long history of racism in medicine in the country. Yeah, so I wanted to bring them in, and of course I give it a completely different twist, which is what you're supposed to do, right? I imagine the night doctors as actual shadowy beings, right? And in fact, to give a Buffy quote, I will say that the gentlemen were
I was picturing the gentleman when I was reading, so you completely hit that.
Yes, I knew you'd get it, yeah. Gentlemen were, I don't know if I thought of them exactly when I was doing it, but as sometime when I was coming up with it, the Gentlemen, of course, one of my favorite Buffy episodes.
Oh yeah, they were
definitely. I could see the Night Doctors as a somewhat darker version of the Gentlemen.
Which should be more than enough for any of our sci-fi fans to hear and just grab this book.
Mm-hmm.
So you leave it open towards the end. Mm-hmm. Are we going to see Maurice and her friends again?
I don't know. That's a good question. I've been asked it several times, and I don't know. I like to leave stories open like that just to give myself an out, right? If I want to do more. I can't say I have something in mind, but as I always say, if the book does well and people really like it and people keep asking, then, probably something will pop up.
When is the book due out?
The book is due out October 13th from Tor.com.
Perfect.
But anyone can pre-order it now.
Yes,
in all the pre-ordering places.
And bookshop. If you can't wait and you're not going to, because our library is definitely going to have it. Bookshop.org is one of our favorite places that we talk to authors about, because they support local independent bookshops. So
great.
It's definitely going to be on our shelves at the library, and will be talked up with with the people who come in. We have several loyal fans of sci-fi, horror, and I think this is going to fit that bill for so many people.
That's great. I hope people are going to be reading it on the Long Island Railroad as they.
Yes, so you have a history with the Long Island Railroad.
I do. I did my graduate studies at Stony Brook, and
Very nice.
I lived in New York and in Brooklyn at the time. And so I know that Long Island Railroad commute, that Port Jefferson. I can still hear it in my head. This is the train to Port Jefferson. The next stop is Syosset. Yeah.
And you would have had to switch your train, I think, to get out to Stony Brook. You don't just
sometimes. Yes, I did have to. You had to get off, and where was it? We got off. I forgot the stop. And now I've forgotten. But yes, I had to switch trains and wait for that second train on a nice, cold January day.
Yes, we sure love our Long Island Railroad.
Yeah, loved it.
Well, once again, I would like to thank you so much for talking to us about this book. I have a million other questions, but they would spoil it for our listeners. So that you just all have to go out and grab it. Again, Tor.com. It will be available in libraries, bookshop.org.
Well, thank you for having me. This was a great discussion. I'm glad. I would love to see your face when I said the gentleman. So
I could probably take a screenshot of it and put it up on the blog part of our when we promote the podcast, because I got very, very excited because in my mind I was like, you got that same feeling when you were reading about them. Like it was like that cold feeling.
Yeah.
And it was like a callback to that. And really, I just love stories about young women fighting demons. Yeah, and Maurice she's up there. She
and Buffy should pal up sometime, right?
I mean, yeah, it's certainly a thing that could happen.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah.
Who knows? I mean, Buffy has been everywhere. She's time traveled.
She has.
She has. All right. So once again, this has been Jessica and
P. Djeli Clark, Henderson Djeli Clark, or P. Djeli Clark.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.